We're on.
Huh?
We're on.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nusalli wa nusallim ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-azim. Amma ba'd. So today we're going to talk about this in Hadith number 17 on Abi Ya'la Shaddad ibn Aus. So Abi Ya'la Shaddad ibn Aus on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Inna Allah kataba al-ihsana ala kulli shay, fa idha kataltum fahsinu qitlah, wa idha dhabhtum fahsinu dhibah, wa yuhidd ahadukum shafratahu, wa yurih dhabihatahu." The English meaning is, verily Allah has prescribed or written ihsan. So we'll have to explain that word, but I've translated it here as proficiency or perfection in all things. So if you kill, then kill well, and if you slaughter, then slaughter well. Let each one of you sharpen his blade, and let him spare suffering to the animal he slaughters. So this is the narration that Imam Nawawi narrates from Imam Muslim. So it has other narrations, and I will give a couple of those. And one of the narrations of it, one of the wordings of it, with a weaker sanad, that is transmission. Inna Allah Azza wa Jal muhsinun fahsinu. Indeed, Allah Azza wa Jal is one who does ihsan, or one who is muhsin. Therefore, you yourselves be excellent or do ihsan. فَإِذَا قَتَلَ أَحَدُكُمْ, when one of you fights, فَيُكْرِمْ مَقْتُولًا, let him show generosity, let him have karam, generosity, compassion towards the one that is fought, or if you translate as one who is killed. وَإِذَا ذَبَحَ, and if he slaughters, وَيُحِدَّ شَفْرَتُ, let him sharpen the blade, وَيُرِحْ ذَبِيحَتُ, and that he might show ease to the slaughtered animal. This is one wording of it. And another wording of it, which is, I have those on the paper, the handout there, I have the variations there, right? So the second one, number 2, he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is narrated by Imam Haythami in Tabarani, and Imam Tabarani says that the men in the narration are thiqat, they're sound, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Idha hakamtum fa'adilu," when you pass judgment, be equitable or just. وَإِذَا قَتَلْتُمْ, and when you slay, فَأَحْسِنُوا, be excellent therein. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مُحْسِنٌ, for indeed Allah is muhsin, يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, Allah loves those who show ihsan or display ihsan. So these are the narrations that have come. So the primary one that is generally quoted is the one that Imam Nawawi, which is the one which has the stronger sanad to it. So as the hadith begins, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, "Inna Allah kataba al-ihsan ala kulli shay." Allah has prescribed. So the first thing to look at, and that's in the paper handout, the handout you have, is the idea is the verb kataba. Now, you study Arabic, you're all familiar with kataba. It usually you understand to mean to write, and the word kitab is that as a written object or a book, or that which is written. So that's something that I think very many Muslims are familiar with that word. And but there are many narrations about in the Quran. There are verses where the verb or derivatives of the verb kataba are used, and so I've cited some of them there. So on the handout you'll see kataba And so there are those, for example, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 103, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى مُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. And that is, and I didn't put down the translation of those verses there. You can go back and reference them out yourself. But in the salah, the ritual prayer, كَانَتْ عَلَى مُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا, is upon the believers binding or prescribed, mawqutan, time specific, the idea of being something time specific. That is, the ritual prayers exist as time specific obligations. This is one understanding. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 182, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kutiba alaykumus siyam, ritual fasting has been prescribed. So the idea of written is the idea of a prescription. So these first two, and then the next one is in Baqarah 2:16, Kutib alaykum al-qital, fighting or warfare has been prescribed for you. All of these three verses then imply, indicate an ijab or obligation. So that's one understanding of the verb in the Quran, or the derivative kitab, that the idea it implies an obligation when Allah uses it in the Quran. The other meaning of it is when it implies the idea of a definitive event. So in Surah Al-Mujadila, verse 21, Allah Ta'ala says, Kataba Allah la'aglibanna anna wa rasuli. Allah has well, how I would translate that, but Allah has maybe how I want to translate that, has prescribed, in the sense, an idea of that this will be a definite outcome, that this is if this event occurs, this is as an event, an unfolding of events, this is what will happen. That Allah and أَغْلِبَنَ أَنَا وَرُسُلِي, that I, Allah, and my messengers will always overcome. So this is a statement of fact, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messengers are always victorious, so to say, in the affairs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed, etc. That's one understanding. In Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 105, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي زَبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ ذِكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا, we have decreed in the Zabur, or in the scripture of David, مِنْ بَعْدِ ذِكْرِ, that is after the revelation. Some say here that this could be, the dhikr here could be in relationship to the Torah. أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ, that أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ, that my servants who are righteous shall inherit the earth. So here again the idea of there is a divine decree. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not a prescription here. The language here is not like the first three verses that deal with the idea of an obligation to perform an act, which is clearly there in those verses that were about ritual prayer or fasting or qital. These are more an idea that in the divine decree something is written. So we go back to the hadith we had before about the pins have been lifted and the pages have dried, which we had in the first hadith, the idea of the divine qadr, the decree. So these verses are in that stream. And then, of course, I think I had another verse there, in Surah Al-Mujadila, verse 22, أُولَٰئِكَ كَتَبَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ إِيمَانٍ. It is these in which faith has been written or decreed for their hearts. So these are some of them that are there. And then there's interesting hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, كُتِبَ عَلَى إِبْنِ آدَمْ حَظُّهُ مِنْ زِنَا فَهُوَ مُدْرِكٌ ذَلِكَ لَا مُحَالَةً. Yeah, that the Prophet ﷺ said that it has been decreed for the son of Adam to experience adultery. He shall indeed experience it. And of course then, this then goes into this, not the idea of adultery and the idea of sexual misconduct, but any type of misappropriation or treachery of one's physical organs. So it's adultery of the eyes, adultery of the tongue, adultery of the ears. And so in the sense that this hadith is saying then that every person will experience these things. It's inherent in the decree of God that your organs will, in a sense, deviate from being absolutely and wholly obedient to God in being used properly. That no person will escape. Now, the caveat there, about the prophets and stuff like that. This is not a theology class here to discuss Isma and all that. But the idea then that you will deviate. You will see things, you will hold things, you will walk towards things, you will say things, you will smell things with your physical organs in your life that were not prescribed for you, that were illicit. Which actually is not, it's almost, in a sense, that is like a good sort of relief in a sense for people, because it's sort of like allowing you then to know that, this is almost inevitable, this is going to happen. That there'll be some place where you're going to make a misstep, a khata'a, you'll stumble. So in a sense, I don't see this hadith as being a really I like that hadith actually. It's quite interesting hadith, allowing us, it's reminding us that, you do make mistakes, you do sin, and all you have to do is, make tawbah and move on from there. And but of course that might be a different hadith for us to look at on that. So then we have in these two in these verses of the Quran and this hadith, then we have these ideas. The idea of something that is binding that must occur. So whether it's a command of God to offer ritual prayer or fasting, it's bound and it's written, it's set there, or in the larger decree of things, in the larger scope of the divine decree, in a sense, in the knowledge of God as things are, as they pan out, then you can see this verb kataba in the Quran and the hadith being used this way. So it doesn't just mean the idea of to write. It has a larger meaning to it. And even, there's when Sayyidina Abu Bakr collected the Quran, and if I remember correctly, reading somewhere that the idea of the Quran as kitab, when he refused to do more than gather the Quran together at the bequest of Sayyidina Umar, that he just had all those scattered documents, parchment, written, whatever the Quran was written on, they were gathered and placed in a box as they were collected. He understood apparently that the concept of Quran as kitab, as something gathered, because that's one of the meanings of it linguistically, is to gather, that met the definition of the Quran as kitab. As long as it was gathered together, it was okay. You didn't have to bind it, as we perceive the idea of a book. So for example, when we understand, when we read the Quran as being a kitab, we can see that it's kitab min Allah, but the first thing that comes to your mind as a common Muslim is what? It's a book from God. But now you can see that it doesn't mean it's a book from God, like this thing sort of fell from heaven, bound and printed, right? That it was something which was a decree of God, or a manifestation of the will of God, in a sense of God interacting, that it contains within it divine command, ordinance, direction, expectation of God to be responded to properly. Or the idea that that the book is really something which comes down, the tanzil of the Quran, there's the inzal of the Quran, is the Quran as before it manifests, it's manifest in Lawh Mahfuz. It is one descent of this divine speech, and then when it is manifested as tanzil, that is from Lawh Mahfuz to the Prophet ﷺ, and then given in a temporal sequence that is through in the 20th years of its manifestation, those are piecemeal issues of the Quran. And in a sense, that's sort of reflective of what it was. It was this sort of piecemeal thing that was out there that is then eventually all brought together. So in a sense, you can almost see this whole gathering of what Sayyidina Abu Bakr did is gathering this the pieces of the Quran as document and putting them into a box. In a sense, is very much a metaphor of what the Quran was in the period of 23 years. It was 23 years of pieces coming, and then it all comes together at the end, and that's the kitab in that meaning. So we can see things in these different levels of understanding. But obviously here then, in this hadith though, it does have specific meanings. And so we need to sort of, to look at them. So he says, وَهِنَئِذٍ then Imam Ibn Rajab says, and therefore, فَهَذَا hadith, this hadith, نَصٌ is a textual evidence في وجوب ihsan, for the obligation of ihsan. This is an explicit text, a statement of the Prophet. It's a nas. It's a textual evidence. That means, what's a nas? It's Quranic text, or a statement of the Prophet, a narrative from the Prophet ﷺ, which acts that sets legal precedent for us. So this is the nas, and it implies wujub because of the usage of the word kataba. There, it implies obligation, because obligation or imposition is implicit in the verb as it's used in the verses of the Quran itself, and in those two meanings we gave, and also in various hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And Allah Ta'ala says in Surah An-Nahl, verse number 90, and you hear this at Jummah prayers as the Jummah prayer wraps up, Inna Allah ya'muru bi'adli wa ihsan. Allah indeed commands to equitableness or balance or justice. The adl is one of these pregnant words. It's a powerful word. What ihsan and ihsan. And Allah Ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah 195, وَأَحْسَنُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Show ihsan or display ihsan, for indeed Allah loves those who do that, the muhsineen. So, of these things that are obligations for us, and there's a hand up, by the way, if you didn't get your hand out. If you need one, you should pick it up. We will look into, but before we get there, then we need to have a quick breakdown of the word. So hasuna in Arabic, hasuna is the root word, the trilateral hasuna, and it's a pattern where the medial letter, the sin, has a dhamma. And these verbs that are like this, hasuna, for example, hasuna yahsunu, these are verbs that are, by their pattern form, are necessarily intransitive. They imply either, you can use them, they're verbs that describe either states or conditions. For example, the idea of hasan might be translated as beauty or something good. So if you say Muhammad yahsunu, that would mean that Muhammad is good. So within himself, he has this good quality. It could be he's handsome. It could just be that his character is good. It has different meanings, but the idea of inherently goodness is there, something pleasant. And its opposite is sayyi'ah in Arabic. So this is what the linguists mentioned, is that the opposite of hasan is sayyi'ah. And that is, of course, one of these words in the tradition that imply sin. It's one of our sin words. And so therefore we know that anything which is sayya is something which is qabih, something which is ugly. Something ugly. Unbecoming. So from this verb then, hasuna, is the derivative ahsana. And all you've done is you've taken the three letters, ha, sin, nun, hasana, and you attach a hamza at the beginning of it. And you put a sukoon over the ha, and you get ahsana. It conjugates in the past tense ahsana, the present tense yuhsin, and the masdar, the gerund, is ihsan. And this is what we're looking at here, is ihsan. By doing this, by altering the verb this way, we now make the verb active. It becomes a transitive verb. That means then the idea of hasan of goodness or beauty is where you extend that from yourself. You extend from yourself things of good, things of beauty, things of excellence. So you engage yourself in a quality that indwells within you, a quality of husn which indwells within you. You start to manifest it towards others and engage in husn in regards to the other. This is what ihsan means then. And it's very similar pattern when the beautiful Gabriel Hadith, which when the Prophet defines ihsan. And each of these verbs, salima, amana, and hasuna, are non-transitive verbs in the Gabriel Hadith. When Gabriel asked the Prophet فأخبرني عن الإسلام فأخبرني عن الإيمان فأخبرني عن الإحسان, inform me what is Islam, inform me what is Iman, inform me what is Ihsan. Each of these verbs, or these words I should say, are all the same pattern, and they all are derived from non-transitive verbs. So the ideas that are implicit there are the idea of manifestation of states. Manifestation of states. And so the Prophet himself has defined ihsan, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه إنه يراك, is to worship God as if you see Him. And though you don't see Him, yet He sees you. And so this meaning is implicit here in this hadith also. That you do things as if you're seeing God. So and that has, of course, we haven't discussed that hadith, and that is one of the hadith here in Imam Nawawi's collection. But it has, we must understand then that whatever we're doing, if we're people of husn, and we want to manifest real ihsan, that is, we want to take goodness. For example, the Prophet was speaking of those who are close to him, or those who have husnul khulq, who have the most beautiful of creative qualities in themselves. So if you have these intrinsic creative qualities within yourself, constituted qualities, fi jabatika, in your nature, fi jalba means your nature, then what you do is that you take these qualities and you want then, and then you bring God into the mix. You bring God here into the mix, and then you see God. You work towards God, you face God, you have tawajjuh towards God, and what that's going to do then is then force you then to take goodness which is in yourself and manifest it out, intensify it out, to manifest it. And so when the Prophet defines to Jibreel that ihsan is to worship Allah as though you could see Him, the idea of you bring yourself in tadallul, in submissiveness, and you brokenness. This is what ubudiyya means, right? That you bring yourself to Allah tadallulan, you break yourself down, you humble yourself, you fall out before God. And in that process of falling out before God, what do? As you do that? Well, you bring yourself to this relationship with God in humility, that it's going to then take qualities that are in you. As the Prophet said in the hadith, those of you who were good in Islam will be good before Islam, will be good in Islam. And that if you have these inherent qualities within you as a Muslim, before you're a Muslim, those things will be enhanced. Islam will synergistically react with you, that is, confronting God as God is, and confronting God as God is through prophetic religion, should alter you in a sense that it takes those inherent good qualities within you and cause them to grow. It's like, Islam is like a yeast in dough. And if you put that yeast in the dough, what is it in the dough? If you don't put the yeast in it, the dough is edible. It's bread, but it's not bread that is light. No one wants to eat dry, thin, tough bread. It's still bread. But what do you want? You want to put yeast in the dough, and you put the yeast in the dough, and bam, the dough rises, and that bread has qualities to it that you, in your mind, call bread. You would rather have that. So in a sense, Islam is that way. If you've got qualities in you before you're a Muslim, or let's say, for example, you're a weak Muslim, or you're a tangential Muslim, you're on the cusp of Islam, you were raised in a Muslim family, but you don't really think about God too much. You're just sort of a passport Muslim. You know, you got your U.S. citizenship because, you know, your parents are expatriates, and, you know, my kids are born in Turkey, and they got their U.S. citizenship because dad's a U.S. citizen. Right? So you got your Islam that way. You know, but you have no idea what it means to be an American, let's say. And so you speak Turkish only, you like, you know, Fenerbahce football team, you know, and this is your life, you know. And then, but you can go to America. Because you got this American passport, and you come to America, you get off the plane, you don't know English, you don't know who the president is, but you're a full-fledged U.S. citizen, but you're not really an American, you're just a U.S. citizen. But the more you interact here then of course, you know, you will lose those virtuous qualities you had in Turkey, and, you know, and all those things, you know, you'll lose it. But, you know, get corrupted most likely. And, but, a little bit of commentary there, right? So, Islam, so then, interfacing with Allah through Islam and Iman will bring forth inherent qualities that are in you will become like yeast will blow up, and you will produce a greater good thing. Okay? So this is what ihsan is about. And so in this hadith then, Allah has decreed ihsan in all things. Because in everything, there is a relationship with God. But we don't necessarily interact properly with God. So as you take the hadith where the Prophet defines ihsan to Jibreel, if you actually bring ihsan that way, you interact with Allah in all things as if you can see Him. So if you cannot relate with God as if you see Him, that means that you receive. You know, it's like if you see something and you acknowledge it without having to be coerced. You don't have to be coerced into doing it. So if you can't do it that way, then you come to you have ihsan, then you know He sees you. So if you can't relate to something in a deeper way, then you should at least relate to God on a more crude level. That God is a raqib, that God is vigilant over you. He's vigilant over you. And of course, you should have gotten that from the idea of iman, the concept of iman, which preceded ihsan in the hadith. Because what's that? You believe in Allah, for example, and there are things about Allah, and the other things that you know about God is that He creates everything, and that He's knowing of everything, and He's informed of everything, He sees everything. So that itself, then, if once you have proper iman, if a deeper idea of facing God completely, willingly, lovingly, is it the synergistic quality within you that turns you towards manifesting ihsan, or manifesting good out of yourself fruitfully, then the fear of God should, that God's going to, you know, He knows you, He sees you, and you're accountable before Him. That way there. So, you know, the carrot and, you know, it's a carrot and a stick approach on that last bit of that hadith, you know. Because ultimately the intent of God is to get you to Jannah. You know, that's the intent there. So Allah wants us to have this ihsan in everything. He wants us to manifest good in all things. And of course the hadith then, well, you know, what are all things then? What are all things? Kulli shay. What is it? That's an am statement, or that's a general statement in Arabic. Everything you have to have ihsan in. Everything. That means like going to the toilet, clipping your fingernails, going shopping at Kroger's, getting gas in your car, which bubble gum you're going to buy for your kids, you know, what shoelaces you want to pick out. Everything has ihsan in it. And of course that makes sense, because everything, if Allah has kataba ihsan, the idea of divine decree and a hukm, and of course the Prophet said, إِذَا أَحْكَمْتُمْ فَعْدِلُوا, when you judge, the idea of hukm, and the idea of a hukm is a modality with everything that exists. Everything has a hukm on it. You know, everything in this room has a hukm, and how you interact with things is a manifestation of a modality, a hukm. So it's you, the object, and God. You, the object, and God. And the object can be a person, your shoe, your car, a cat, a leaf, a whale, whatever. And you have, it's a triad, always a triad. You, something else, and Allah. You, something else, and Allah. This triad always exists. And there's always a hukam at the moment, right there. And so, what are then all these things that everything then has a relationship with God, and you can have a relationship with all these things out there, like yourself. You're a thing, and those things are a thing. And of course, the idea of shay in Arabic, shay, kulli shay, a shay in Arabic word for shay, linguistically, from a theological means anything that exists. Anything that exists. It has wujud to it, existence to it. This is a shay. So, Ibn Rajab here then mentions, and the first thing he says, there are certain types where there's an obligation. So what are these things that are obligatory you have to have excellence in? And so the first thing he mentions is ihsan ila waladain wa arham. Is that you have excellence towards your parents and towards the wombs. That is, your parents and your family. That you have excellence towards them. Of course, that's a very broad topic, which we won't be able to cover at all in depth. That you have sila rahim. That you bind, you wasala, you bind. So sila is from wasala, you bind wounds. You connect your family. You keep your family relationships. And this is the first thing that he says, Ibn Rajab says, is a necessity that is a wajib. It's a wajib type of ihsan. Is your mom, your dad, your siblings, etc., your family. These are people that you need to be very mindful of, that you are dealing with properly. So sometimes he says, though, that there's ihsan in optional things. That's just water and everything. My book is all wet. Such as kasalik the tawwa. So, for example, optional charity, for example. It's not zakat. It's not the zakat of Eid al-Fitr. It's not a expiation for an oath. You have to, it's a payment, right? It might be a payment. So this is a nadabun. It's an option. It's recommended. It's an optional charity, for example, or a smile, for example, on someone. These things are optional acts of ihsan that you can do. They're not things that you are bound to do, but if you do them, they display goodness within yourself. So I don't think I need to dwell too much on that, especially with the time constraints that we have. And then, of course, he mentions here the ihsan fi tark muharramat, that there's ihsan in leaving the things that are prescribed, the things that are haram on you, the things that have a restriction on them. They're in that forbidden zone, right? And these things are zahiran or batinan. There are things that are internal and things that are external. Allah Ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am, وَذَرُّ ظَاهِرَ إِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ. Allah says, ذَرُّ, leave, set aside, ظَاهِرَ إِثْم, outwardness of itham, or sin, or harm. وَبَاطِنَهُ, and that which is hidden. Okay? And the idea of atham here, the idea of harming, of something which is harmful for you. And so, obviously then, ihsan for you, when it comes to your obligatory prayers, your fasting, these are things which are, given. It's an obligation to, that your income is licit, your expenditures are licit, unless there is a circumstance of necessity where you can restrict that or modify that, but in a sense, those things are there. So all these things and of course that requires then you to know what are obligatory for you, for example. And that's another discussion. Every Muslim needs to know. You need to know that are things that are obligatory upon you, whether as acts that need to be fulfilled or things that need to be avoided. So you need to know things that are haram and things that are fard in your life, or things that are wajib in a larger context. You need to know these things. So if you don't know those things, you need to, you need to spend some time trying to read upon them and understand them. He also mentions here the idea of ihsan fi sabr, that you have ihsan in sabr. That is, things that are maqdurat, things that are decreed for you, in the sense that things that occur to you outside of your control, that are bigger, the bigger picture of things that you get caught up in, that you cannot at that moment from your own volition alter, but you have to experience it. A car accident, for example, something occurs and bam, someone hits you, or anything like that. We may have musibah, an affliction, a hardship, a trial. These things then, ihsan in them is that you are consistent in how you respond to them. So for example, you don't despair, you don't become despairing of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any situation. You don't become overjoyed when something good comes your way. And if things bad comes your way, you don't get too despondent with it. But you are thankful and acknowledge Allah, right? كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ. So when you see Allah in everything, right? You're seeing Allah in a hardship, you're seeing Allah in the good times. So you're never excessive in either point because you know it all came from Allah. The author is Allah on your affairs. And so that's having ihsan, because you're taking كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ, as if you see Allah in all your affairs. And so you acknowledge Allah as the muqaddir, the one who decrees and measures things. This is an area of ihsan that deals with sabr, according to Ibn Rajab. Then there's ihsan al-wajib. There's a necessary type of ihsan that deals with mu'amalat al-khalq, as you interact, your mu'amalat, your social interactions with other people. So for example, you must endeavor to, he mentions here, al-qiyamu bima awjaba Allah min huquqi dhalika kullih, is that you must establish rights. If people have rights due to them, they have haqq on them, your ihsan is to give them their rights. So if you're an employer, you make sure your employees are properly paid on time, or that their working conditions are appropriate for them, or agreeable. You don't expect them to do things that are beyond their capacity. Or you may not expect people to do anything for you. All issues like this, in a sense, how you interact with people, you can think of many examples of them that you have to deal with them. So if you're an employee, you make sure that you bind yourself to proper relationships with your employer. You don't, unless it's permissible or it's something which is just understood, it's okay. You don't borrow the work, your office computer for home work, for example, unless it's been stipulated you're allowed to do that. You're thinking of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz when he was Khalifa, when he was the Umayyad Khalifa, how he would have a candle for official work and a candle for private work. So the candle that came from Baytul Mal, which was the candle that was in the public treasury, he would use that one for lighting it to read official documents and official work. And then when it came to writing personal correspondence and things like that, he'd put out that candle and light another candle which he bought himself. And so he discriminated between the public and public obligations, the haqq, and then his own private usage. Wow, if you had an employee like that, probably wouldn't have all the economic woes that we have these days. But these are all ideals, right? Ideals, mashallah. Fantastical Islam, the Islam that really never was, except for the Prophet ﷺ, because everyone after the Prophet ﷺ, they had some degree or something. Everyone, had their points of slippage. Of course, there were fewer the earliest Muslims, many of them, and there are more today with us than we care to enumerate. Probably could not enumerate them. But then the hadith continues. فَإِذَا قَتَلْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا قِتْلَةً. So when you slay or fight, then you need to show excellence in that. And then hadith, وَإِذَا ذَبَحْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا الذِّبْحَةَ. And then when you slaughter an animal, then show ihsan in the idea in your slaughtering. وَلَا يُحِدَّ أَحَدُكُمْ شَفْرَاتُهُ وَلَا يُرِحْ ذِبَاتُهُ. And then let one of you sharpen his blade and relieve the animal being slaughtered. So we need to look at that then. So obviously the hadith then has this beautiful beginning. The hadith begins very beautifully with this idea of ihsan and everything. But then it immediately comes into issues that are not necessarily on our radar screen of things that we want to engage in. Now, most of us don't want to end up having to fight or kill someone. We try to avoid it, and we should avoid it. And there is a virtue in qital, in sacred warfare, but it should not be sought. It should be avoided at all costs. But if it occurs, you don't turn your back. And of course, next week when we have the Islamophobia talk on jihad, I will talk a lot about that. So I'm not going to do that today because I don't want to let all the secrets from my little bag of goodies. It's like Santa Claus has to distribute all the gifts properly. You can't eat all your Halloween goodies at one time. You get sick. So bad metaphors for an Islamic talk. But hey, what can I say? That's where we live at. And but in this then, the idea, the Prophet talks about these two crude acts, the spilling of blood. And in the spilling of blood, because for example, human life and animal life, now I'm not talking about fish, for example. I'm not talking about crayfish and shrimp and these seafood. I'm talking about aquatic animals that you can eat, and there's no manner of slaughtering them because they come from pure water. We're not talking about that. We're talking about animals and people where God allows you, because they are already in a tahrim, that their life is sacrosanct. That's the default. So meat you eat, for example, chicken or beef or goat or kangaroo, all these animals that you eat, their flesh is illicit for you. You may be born with canines, but those canines have a restriction implicit upon how they're used on living flesh. And so you have to have, it has to be made halalakum, it has to be made licit for you. Okay, it has to be made licit for you. So Allah gives you permission to either take a human life or to kill an animal. They're not just givens that exist out there. And when you do them otherwise, then you have transgressed the sanctity of that human or that animal, and you have transgressed against God's limit on the sanctity that He has inherently prescribed on a human being and an animal that you slaughter. So then, now we have to have excellence then in sanctifying our activity. That we have to see God now in this activity where He has allowed us then to take life. So this then is the idea then, excellence in qital and in dhabha, that is excellence in spilling of blood. So the Quran says, فَإِذَا لَقِيتُمْ الَّذِينَ كَفْرُوا فَضَرَبَ رِقَابٍ. When you meet those who disbelieve, then strike their necks. This is Surah Muhammad, verse number 4. And scholars talk about this idea of for example, in this verse, why this verse like this? Why does Allah say strike their necks? And if you're, an Islamophobe and you hate Islam, this is one of your big verses there to go out and say, look at these evil Muslims, they're out to kill us, and we're really in trouble here. We're going to pass all this legislation to stop them, the hordes of them coming to America, corrupting our lives. Of course, we have 1 million abortions in America every year. It's perfectly okay to kill a fetus. And it's perfectly okay to have the most number of executions of any country in the world, or prisoners in most number in any country in the world, the United States. That's okay. There's really nothing wrong with that in our social structure that be that way. But God forbid these Muslims come along. You know. But the idea, when the Prophet ﷺ said, La tumathilu wa la taqtulu walid. The Prophet said, La tumathilu, do not, what's tumathilu mean? Mathila means to have a form. Here it means do not deform or do not mutilate. Mutilation is forbidden. Mutilation, and of course, and the killing of children. Wala taqtulu walid, a child, an infant. So, on this point then, for example, in this verse from Surah Muhammad, Muslim scholars talk about Muslims, when they slay, they have to do it in an efficient manner. So you do not mutilate or cause excessive pain. So this is one way to understand this. Now, next Friday we'll talk about permission given to fight and why that may exist, why it exists in the Quran, and we can talk more about that next Saturday, and we will. So if you're here today, and if you're going to watch it next week online, is it going to be live next week? Inshallah. Then you'll have an earful of all this. So I'm not going to discuss it in depth today. But one thing you can take away then from this is that the idea that when you fight, the Muslim has to have precision in fighting. So technically then, if one sort of wants to extrapolate from this, what I said now, there must be certain types of warfare that Islam doesn't deny warfare. There must be certain types of warfare which are inherently abhorrent from the Muslim mind. And some of those, I would say, would be like landmines, for example, or carpet bombing. Things where you do mass destruction, where you mutilate. You have tamathul. Islam would be inherently against these things. So we've got a problem there, don't we? What's the problem there? The problem is, what about if your enemies do those things? How do you respond back? What about if you're forced then to play their game? That's a problem. That's an ethical problem for a Muslim. That's an ethical problem we have to realize. But unfortunately, Muslims are not very ethical in our time. That's another problem we have, because we've lost an ethical mooring. Because we're not seeing God through ihsan anymore. So we then sort of lower ourselves to the common standard. And so we justify then brutality. So for example, that incident a couple weeks ago of those U.S. soldiers urinating on the Taliban, corpses, if you had read all those Yahoo News, and all the 6,000 responses, what were all those responses? Were what? Well, what about that American soldier who was decapitated and he was shown on YouTube? Where you have a mujahid, quote unquote, Al-Qaeda, quote unquote, severing a head, or those online public executions. And any Muslim, would be revolted by that. But the people who are doing it, they feel perfectly justified. Tit for tat, eye for eye. The law of Talanus, the law of eye for an eye. So we respond in like. And they might even justify it from the events of the time when, there are events there where the Prophet ﷺ did, there were certain people, and it's mentioned here, who were mutilated. But that was because of something else. There's a context for that. But this is not a standard. But Muslims then can justify a cruelty because they feel that cruelty has been done to us. So there's a real sense that we've lost a sense of ethical, we're not taking the high ground. We may live in a country that espouses a high ground, but when it comes down to the machinery of warfare, it's not. You can always espouse from buildings with beautiful marble columns and eagles virtue and values. But when it comes to the techniques of your warfare, how you actually engage, that's totally different. But that's the nature of warfare, is that if you dehumanize the other, it's easier to take their life. So as Muslims, we're different. We have to be, even when we're so angry, that you know how to take that. Unfortunately, you'll get a lot of that next week, inshallah. I'll stand on a big soapbox then. I'll have a big soapbox out there. I might actually just get a soapbox and stand on it, and I will rant on as I go on about some of these things. So, according then to the Prophet ﷺ, Allah has decreed in warfare, in qital, there must be a way that from yourself, your state of husn, of goodness, of husnul khulq, of good quality and character traits, you will manifest husn towards the one opposite of you. What's the sign of munafiq, for example? That when he argues, he's abusive, for example. Then when a munafiq, a hypocrite, argues, he lies and he makes a promise, he doesn't keep it. When he speaks, he lies, and what? And when he argues, he's abusive. Because in himself, there is ugliness. Like you tell your kids, when you say all those bad words, that's just what's in you. It's not like you say a good word and it comes up to your lips and all of a sudden it's filtered through the bad word filter and it's changed into a bad word. It's not what's happening. It's what's in you is manifesting itself. So when we see individually and Muslims internationally doing things, you're just seeing what's from them, what's in them. It's like a clay pot, right? It's that metaphor of the clay pot that sweats. The clay pot, you use it to cool water, and the jug, you don't know what's in the jug. All you have to do is just wipe the pot and smell it or taste it. You'll know what's in it because it's what's inside that oozed out that's evaporating, which is cooling it. So that's all you need to know. You don't need to cut out someone's heart to find out what's in them. You just need to see what's on their hand and what's on their tongue to know what's in them. So that's one point I mentioned about qital there on that. There's more mentioned here, but next week I will cover those things. And as for dhibha, the idea then of your animal, the animal that you sacrifice, what's excellence towards that? So, obviously the Prophet ﷺ, said, he forbade sabr baha'im. And what that means is that when you confine an animal, and you hit it with an object until it dies, as a means of killing an animal. So it's like you tie it up, or you put it in a restricted container. Think of veal calves, for example. These little calves, they're kept they can't move because you want their muscles to atrophy. For example, you want to be weak, so you have a nice soft pink meat. MashaAllah, it's expensive. And so this animal was basically kept in a confined space. It was fed food that kept it anemic, and you get this, very delicious meat. But to get there, if you saw the animal, you'd probably hang him high who hung up the veal calf, and you'd probably let them all go, if you knew where it was coming from. Or your chickens, for example, in mass-produced chickens, for example, in these cages. That's what the Prophet said, animals sabr baha'im, animals that are kept in confined spaces. He forbid this, for example. So the idea then of ihsan towards our slaughtering is that, quickly, because we have to end this class right now, but we can maybe cover this another time, maybe on issues of this, is the idea that you want to eat things in your life and take things that the animal was well treated, that it was well fed, that it wasn't confined. So you need to be very mindful, this is a Muslim, how you get your food. And just because it says, it's min hamar or whatever halal meat product it is, just call up Iowa and find out what's going on in Iowa where it's being produced, or in Canada, how is it being slaughtered. I was driving through Texas and these cows, these giant holding pens in mud, all these cattle in mud, like thousands of them in mud, and it's so sad. There's waiting to be gone to a, this assembly line to be slaughtered. What's the difference between putting people in a work, in Auschwitz, and says, Arbeit macht Freiheit, work is freedom, and putting them there as slaves, human slaves, and executing them, then putting a bunch of other non-human animals in the same thing and marching them off to the slaughterhouse. Because even then there's an issue there of our humanity where we don't associate ourselves properly. We don't see them as communities, as ummah, of living things. As the Quran mentions, there are many ummahs out there. So we only speak of the Muslim ummah. As Muslims, some of us only see the Muslim ummah, and all the kuffar ummah are expendable, let alone the other entities out there, the fish and the cattle and the monkeys and all the other ummah out there. Forget them. Some of the worst countries and communities of environmental violations are Muslim majority countries. Of course, that's to their detriment, because if you don't maintain your natural environment, you're not going to have any clean water, good soil to feed your massive ummah. Anyway, so these are a few things. Now, there's more to talk about that, but I think the things I said can leave you, because we need to wrap up this session. But obviously, especially the issue on warfare next week, inshallah, at the Islamophobia class, that full day, when there'll be a lot, and I will bring up this hadith, by the way, in that discussion, and how we need to maybe relate to that, inshallah ta'ala. Yes. So we're going to take a break. So I'll say salam to everyone, and we will come back here. We'll be here and just give us a few minutes, and Taj has administrative stuff to do, inshallah, and then you guys.